Welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Katie Mills, the head of Zygo Power at Schneider Electric. And in this podcast, we meet incredible individuals from a range of industries to discuss the exciting projects they're involved with today, their career journey to date, and ultimately what impact their work is having on the world. In this episode, we're making an impact with Jace Tyrrell, CEO of Opportunity London, whose 25-year career has been all about urban regeneration, destination development, and campaigning in both the UK and Australia. We're going to be hearing about how London is a great place for green investment opportunities. Welcome, Jace, to Making an Impact. So to kick us off, tell me a little bit about Opportunity London. What is it and why does it exist?
The big question to get us going.
Absolutely.
So look, Opportunity London, it's quite a new venture for the capital, and it's a way we can work together to actually get the allocation of global investment into London, because London is a global city. There's a lot of people wanting to invest, but actually knowing about those opportunities, navigating quite a complex city as well. We are there to be that partner to unlock these deals. And the big mission is 100 billion over the next decade into low carbon energy, infrastructure and real estate. So got the mission and ready to go, and it's a fantastic partnership, and obviously Schneider are one of our founding partners.
Absolutely. I know Kelly Becker, our president of the UK and Ireland, sits on your kind of steering committee, right, as well?
She absolutely does, yeah.
And so actually talking about that, obviously collaboration is key, right, in kind of partnerships and programs like this. How do you see that collaboration working between organisations? Why is it important? How does it help drive things, I suppose?
But when you have big global cities, and I spent time in New York, in Singapore, in London, there's a lot of interest from different sectors, public and private sector. There's a lot of global competition for capital and investment as well. So I think the more that you can actually come together collectively, both the public and private sector, different industries, different players, to actually share the end goal and bring forward schemes that are investable as well. This is kind of the raison d'etre of what Opportunity London is as a partnership. So I think having various sectors, having different people around the table to help us shape those strategies is really important to the success of our mission, which is ultimately to unlock that 100 billion for London over the next decade.
And when you talk about different sectors, as you just mentioned, where are those opportunities that you're seeing across London that maybe people aren't as aware of, right? I think everyone thinks of London as that financial institution, right? That centre of all the financial services. But what else is there that people maybe aren't aware of that you are seeing kind of a lot of opportunity in, especially around net zero and sustainability and things like that?
So I think you're right. When we think about London, we think about the city, obviously, with financial professional services. We think about the West End in terms of all that brings as well. And then some amazing bits along the river as well. And of course, those that live in London like us, there's some amazing villages and towns on the outer bits as well. But it is a city of 10 million people. It's 32 boroughs. And look, for most global cities around the world, and London's not excluded from this, housing is a top priority. People that live in the city and work in the city as well. And linked to that is our race to net zero. So how do we provide the infrastructure, the public transport, the energy, the retrofit at scale? And it's complex. It's a large city. It's like 32 boroughs. The mayor's office, lots of different planning and policies. And how do we ensure for the city for the next 25 years, which is all of London, not just the city of London, which of course the city is an important part of that. How do we make sure the strategy, the investment, what we're all trying to do collectively scales up to the outcome that we all want as well? So it's been quite interesting in this role. I've only been doing it 9 months, heading this up, but I've been on a journey literally visiting every single borough across London. And, I've lived in London 20 years. You probably can't tell from the accent. I did grow up in Australia. But actually, there's bits of London I've never seen. There are sort of boroughs and leaders and residents and communities I've never sort of come across. And actually, what was really striking is sustainability really does come up in a lot of conversations. I think there's a real desire to get there quickly and to work collectively. But I think sometimes you need a sort of partnership, overarching body to sort of coordinate that and drive it and make sure we're all pointing in the same direction.
So touching upon the sustainability element, when you're having these discussions with, potential investors from other parts of the world that are looking at London as an opportunity, how high up the priority list are you seeing those discussions around sustainability from an investor perspective?
So I've been working in inward investment for about 2 decades, and I would say the shift really happened about 5 years ago. So I think before that, whether it's right or wrong, it was all around fiduciary return and actually making sure shareholders and investors got a return. And I think for a lot of institutional investors, like the big pension funds around the world, for your sort of private investment as well, of course, financial return is important. But I actually feel sitting in boardrooms, talking to investors. I've just come back from like 6 countries actually in 6 weeks. So quite a lot of air miles in that as well. But
I won't ask you your carbon footprint then.
I know I do an offset in a different way for that.
Just checking.
Yeah, exactly right. But I think it does come up genuinely in these boardrooms with these investors. And there's a lot of opportunity funds. There's sustainability, energy funds. There's social impact funds. And actually, it's no longer just a footnote or a kind of ESG we're ticking a box. It genuinely feels these funds and these investors know to get the returns of the future, they need to be resilient and they need to be sustainable in all aspects. And that requires them putting allocation into sustainable ventures and businesses and investments, in capital investment as well. So I think, in some ways, I feel the market and the investors are moving quicker than governments and states.
Yep.
You might pick this up in your business as well, but I feel like the market's responding to this it's sort of existential if we don't get this right, in the future.
Yep.
And I feel we are moving quicker and faster than perhaps where some governments are moving around the world.
Absolutely. And let's kind of, not talking about kind of governments in particular, but I think, there is still a crucial role, right, that government and regulation and policy plays in all elements of these things, because you'll get those that are definitely forward thinking and are on the front foot.
Yes.
You get those laggards that, take their time and sometimes need that push from a regulation perspective.
Yeah.
What role can you see government playing when it comes to supporting sustainable investment, let's say, into cities such as London?
I always talk about this triangle. You need to have the government, the regulators, you need to have the citizens, you need to have business. And when all three in the triangle are aligned, that is where the magic happens. And there'll be different strains and pressures on different elements of that as well. But, let's acknowledge, whatever level of government in the UK, whether it's national, the mayor's office, local councils, they have a really important role here in terms of the policy they're setting out, the targets they want to get to. From our world in sort of real estate and capital investment, they own a lot of the land as well. They might be co-investing. So it's really important they articulate and stick to those targets they want to do as well. And sometimes you need regulation, and sometimes you also need carrots and incentives to move the market quicker and faster as well. We might come back to New York, actually, because there's some very interesting work happening there in Local Law 97, which is quite granular, but I might come back to that in a minute.
Talk to me now about it. Tell me a little bit about it.
It's quite interesting because over there, they've got this economic development corporation, which is very large in New York, and they own a whole chunk of land out there. But actually, they're using this local law to really incentivize a move to decarbon really rapidly in the real estate world. And if you don't, they're quite punitive fines coming through in the next couple of years. But the money they're raising is actually given back to those that are moving faster in the real estate world with their developments, with their embodied carbon, with their operational carbon. And actually, that is encouraging them to move quicker because there's a tax abatement there. So I think sometimes you can use the carrot and sticks to actually get a change from the market in a quicker pace as well. So I was very interested in that when we went with the London delegation recently to see could some of that be applied back here in London as well. But I think the other bits in that triangle, obviously you've got consumers, users, residents. I mean, there isn't a conversation in London, I think, where people don't want to get to net zero rapidly. Yeah. Sort of how you get there, the cost of it, the efficiencies, the technology, all the stuff that you do brilliantly at Schneider. And then, of course, in the investment world and business, again, different sectors have different approaches to that as well. But I think our job really from a London level is, we've got those targets, we've got motivation, we need to make sure the capital is being allocated. But I think, 2025 is nearly upon us. This is the decade of delivery. I think we're going to see some targets missed by 2030. So we need to understand why and how we can accelerate beyond that as well.
Okay. And I want to touch upon a little bit around housing, right? You're right. From a consumer perspective, I think within cities and kind of communities, naturally housing is one of the largest carbon emitters.
Yes.
We have especially in the UK and in London, we have very much kind of an aging housing stock. Doesn't lend itself to kind of sustainability and net zero in the kind of simplest of ways. Yes. How do you see us tackling this as London? Like, where do we start? I know it's a huge challenge and I'm asking you a big question here, but
yes.
As a consumer, where should I start when I'm thinking about my own kind of carbon footprint from a housing perspective?
It's so challenging, I think, for sort of the consumer, you say, the citizen, us, that live in a city. Like, where do we start? It can be so mammoth, this task. We want to do good, and it might be as simple as just which energy provider are you using, for example? Are you switching? In a previous role, I used to work in the West End, and we had a lot of residents living in Mayfair and Soho and a lot of small businesses there. And we actually just had a very simple tool, which was a sort of preferred supplier scheme, which was getting, both people that live in the area, but also work in the area, those companies, to switch to cleaner energy, for example. That's one aspect, obviously, when you think about, net zero in terms of the building and the operational piece. But simple cues and just making some financial incentives to switch can be part of it, but also doing good, quite frankly. But you need to measure that, right? Which is where I'm sure all the tools that you have come into that process as well. But on the larger scale for London, you're right. We have a lot of historic stock, both housing, but also commercial office stock. You've got Victorian buildings, very energy inefficient, owned by a lot of different people. It's quite disparate in terms of that ownership. So how do you scale to do something that could create an impact? I think one thing we're looking at this year actually is working with a lot of the local councils in London to understand their housing stock and whether there's a financial model where there's some upfront capital to get these housing stock retrofit at scale. And somewhere along the line of that, there's actually a sort of payment back to those investors, could be because of the savings on the energy bills, because we have a 50, 60-year life cycle, but actually that will unlock upfront forward capital that could retrofit and make them more energy efficient, all these houses. And that becomes an income stream for some of these large pension funds around the world. So, we all sit around the board tables trying to find solutions to some of these problems. But I think any ideas your viewers and listeners have as well, we're open to this, right? We've got to solve this together. And I think for London in particular, we've got to move at scale. There's some very good pockets of innovation and pilots happening, but we've now really got to accelerate some of this thinking and work to make the impact.
So when we think about scale, I've seen quite recently a lot of financial institutions, banks, right, that have large mortgage portfolios, part of their scope 3, right, are these mortgage portfolios. And actually, they're thinking about this as an opportunity from an investment perspective.
Yes.
Like, how can I offer a green incentive to my mortgage portfolio, which helps me deal with my scope 3?
Yes.
But also there is, a financial gain to be had off the back of this.
Yes.
Which is quite an innovative way of thinking of it.
Completely.
Where else do you see these kind of new ways of innovating when it comes to thinking about being green and the financial incentives associated to it?
It's quite interesting generally, isn't it? Because I think the public and private sector have different sort of measures of success, right? And not one or the other is right or wrong, right? And I think the public sector has agency and they're about citizens and safety, and absolutely right. And then the private sector, there's a motivation in business, but also about longevity of your organization or your company or your business model, whatever that is as well. So I think these conversations happening again all over the place in different sectors, how do you create financial incentive but also do the right thing in terms of environmental performance? I think there's some very clever thinking coming, and particularly in the financial markets and that world. So I think we're seeing the start of it, and certainly not the end of it as we come through. I mean, one thing we've looked at in housing, and I've inherited this actually when I sort of joined the organization, was could we find a model where we club together maybe 15 funds around the world? We raise 5 billion, for example, upfront capital, £5 billion. And that could be deployed on sort of what we call discount market rent housing, so middle income housing. Because in London, we have a lot of people at the top end that can't afford that, obviously, because they're so priced out. And we have a lot of people falling into affordable and social. But there's a huge cohort of people that work in London, sort of middle income, if you like, that just can't afford any housing. So if we found a model which perhaps 20 or 30% discount, through this fund, that actually people that work in London and want to have a career in London can actually get onto the housing ladder, that could be a tool and a fund that could work for the capital as well. And that could provide, 20,000 homes from our estimates as well. So this is the sort of thinking we're trying to do at London level, where we work collectively, we share risk, we try and scale. And I'm certain when we get into energy transition, retrofit at scale, there's going to be similar schemes like this that we can bring forward as well and work together on.
An example for you, and I bring this up because I've just very recently had an experience of this myself. So I have a very traditional Victorian terraced East London home.
Yes.
We made
a very cool neighbourhood, by the way.
Absolutely, Walthamstow.
Yes.
Absolutely, to all my kind of fellow Walthamstowers out there.
Exactly.
But we made the decision to, because of the job that I do and how important sustainability is to me, to get rid of our gas boiler, and we put in an electric boiler. I made sure that our tariff and our energy supplier was the best one that I could have from a kind of renewables perspective.
Yes.
We've put solar on the roof. We have all new double glazing.
Yes.
We've recently had our new EPC rating done.
Yes.
And it comes in as an F because we have an electric boiler.
Gosh.
So you end up being actually penalised for trying to do all
the
right things.
Yeah, yes.
This is just an example. I appreciate I'm kind of throwing this at you.
Yeah.
But for me, that was a typical case of our old ways of doing things are not fit for purpose now.
Correct.
Where else do you see? I'm sure you must see this a lot, right? When you think of the way that we do things. How do we flag these issues and deal with it so that we are incentivizing people in the right way to do the right thing.
100%. That's such a good example, though. It's so practical. And where's your incentive to invest?
And I had no idea until the EPC rating came in, because we were trying to sell our house and we were like, oh no, now what do we do?
Yeah.
But it was just a really great example for me of...
It's a sharp end of, where there's failure with old systems trying to sort of circumvent into the new world effectively as well. I mean, people like the Green Building Council, I'm sure you're familiar with. This is the sort of work, they should take this stuff on, right? Because this is the sort of stuff where regulation, rating needs to constantly evolve, I was really impressed, Neighbours, which is obviously came from Australia, which is the rating system for buildings, which is now universal. But even them, they're looking again. It's so well regarded, but actually is it fit for purpose for the future? And I was just working in Sydney last year, and we had a lot of conversations out there around the Neighbours rating, and actually it needs to evolve a bit as well. But I think there's other sort of industries where you've got different ratings and standards, like retrofit. On planning policy, there's some very perverse things around the use of offices. And actually, we know the office market is changing around the world.
Of course.
We need to think whether more housing goes into some of this stock, or whether there might be more education, universities, colleges, life sciences coming in. But again, there's a very sort of protracted and prescriptive policy out there for planning, which means you can't change an office into some of these other uses. And actually, to get the investment to work for retrofit, rather than knocking down these buildings, actually retrofitting them, repurposing.
Absolutely.
Things like just in terms of planning policy and the usage class could be looked at, and things like VAT, for example. These are very granular points here, but VAT is, if you want to do a retrofit, you don't get the tax benefits of doing that. So we think there's some very not easy, but some ways the government could shift the investment community to make these decisions, which will get the better outcomes by some changes in policy or tax, quite marginal, that would get the outcomes we want as well.
Big impacts, right? Like
totally.
Completely changing incentivization. You're not penalizing people for doing the right thing.
Yes.
You're incentivizing them, which is obviously, ultimately what it comes down to at the end of the day. As much as we all want to feel like we're doing the right thing.
Yes.
Naturally, there is always a return on investment needed, right? So
100%,
absolutely.
100%.
So looking at the kind of community aspect of Opportunity London and just, I suppose, investing in London in general. When we talk about private and social housing, where do you see the challenges from a kind of social housing perspective? Private's one thing. I appreciate I gave my example.
Yes.
But that's my own house, and I'm in a very privileged position to own my own house. Social housing is obviously a very different challenge. But how do you see this as an opportunity for social housing?
I think, look, London is complex. There's such high demand for housing. First of all, we need to house the citizens, right, that need physical, a sort of universal right. And that's really important. And that certainly my values and the values of the city and the values of the mayor as well. And then, the cost and the scale. We talked about this a bit earlier. How do we actually fund this sort of, sustainable housing of the future, and how do we make sure there's enough housing for the future as well? I have to say, give credit to this new government. It's sort of 2 months in now, isn't it? But I think the signals they're pushing on house building at scale, thinking about grey belt, maybe bits of the green belt, thinking about all types of different tenure, which is really important, really pushing local authorities, to bring forward housing at scale. That's a really important signal to the market, because I think that gives the market confidence that actually the regulation and the government support is there as well. So I would hope we're sitting here in 5 years' time, and actually that 300,000 a year, a large chunk of them are in London and the southeast in terms of housing. We've been really able to deliver against that as well. And I have to say, there isn't one borough I go to in London where they don't want to support their local residents. They want to provide the housing. They want investors desperately to go in there. And part of our job is to perhaps think about a portfolio of different boroughs and different schemes and different projects and take that to investors. Because there's some amazing schemes out there, like Naveen, actually, from the US. They've got a 16 billion allocation globally, US, into affordable housing. How do we get a chunk of that for London? So I think the ambition and the desire is there. It's how we turn some of that into deliverability, and how do we sort of accelerate the pace of that deliverability as well. Linked to all that, though, is where's the energy come from for these houses? The materials, the workforce, the supply chain to deliver that. So we've got some structural issues to deal with as well in terms of doing that. But I think the narrative is right, the ambition is right. I think the deliverability is where we're focused on from an Opportunity London perspective.
And I don't know how you feel about this, but I do feel from a housing perspective, we have all the technology we need. It already exists.
Yes.
We have to figure out how we package it up in a way that makes it more financially attractive.
Yes.
And viable for a lot of people.
Yes.
But the encouraging thing for me is we're not looking for some amazing innovation from a technology perspective,
it's
right?
There.
It already exists, and that's a really exciting opportunity in many ways if we can just be clever with how we financially incentivize people.
In your world, have you seen other countries in the world or cities do this well, and in terms of the pace of delivery?
I actually think housing in particular is one of the main areas that everywhere struggles.
Yes, yeah.
I think, I don't think I've seen any particular area, country, city that has absolutely nailed it and is really driving change at the speed at which we need to see.
Yes.
Especially if you look at stats, a majority of our emissions as a country sits within our housing stock.
Yeah, exactly right.
So
one of the largest, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so, I think it's a lot easier for nations that are building at scale from day one, right? They're not dealing with necessarily aging housing stock.
Exactly.
They are building from scratch.
Absolutely.
Singapore
is a really good example.
Absolutely.
Not that they've been a while, but actually they've done a lot of building, haven't they, in the last 50 years?
100%.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about building at scale and you look in kind of, the typical places like Dubai and the UAE, like when you talk about building at scale, they are masters at building at scale.
Totally, yes.
But I do think still the piece missing, actually, even when you're building at scale, is thinking about the full life cycle of the product. When I mean product, I mean the building or the asset or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Because, we're talking about net zero from an emissions perspective, but when you start thinking about embodied carbon.
Exactly right.
Scope 3.
Yes.
That's a whole different ball game and another huge challenge for any organization, whatever sector they're in.
Totally.
So thinking about, the full life cycle of your asset from day one through to end of life.
Yes.
Through to retrofit or whatever it is, I still think that's a piece of the puzzle that we still miss and are missing a lot of the time.
What's interesting as well, like we spend a lot of time with different property owners and developers in London. And again, they're thinking about their building materials. And I had an example the other day with a major owner and developer here. And they're very good at sort of doing the circular economy with materials within their own portfolio. But actually what we haven't really got is almost like a platform for London. Yeah. You've got all these developers, from house builders to commercial, with all this different stock, from a retrofit. So rather than demolition, we're actually recycling the stock and repurposing. How do we almost create a platform for London that we became a trading platform of all these materials? So rather than sitting in a warehouse and not being used, actually can another developer or builder actually use some of these materials for their own schemes as well outside of the group? I definitely think there's a business opportunity or a sort of trading platform opportunity for London that can actually lead the world in some of this as well.
It's that circular economy idea, right? Like there is definitely a business opportunity around circular economy.
Yes.
And thinking about that in a different way.
Yeah.
And I've seen quite a few startups actually doing some really interesting stuff in not necessarily in the kind of building material space, but in the circular economy space.
Yes.
And I think we'll start to see more and more innovations over the next few years around that, and some really kind of successful businesses around that too. So
I agree.
I think it's a really exciting opportunity actually, circular economy.
Yeah.
A couple of other questions then about Opportunity London. London, everyone knows London.
Yes.
It's a pretty famous city.
Yes.
We have a lot of history.
Yeah.
We have a king. And we did have a queen too.
We
so,
did.
Everyone knows us for kind of many reasons.
Yes.
Why do we then need an organisation like Opportunity London? What is it that people struggle with when they look at investing in a city like London?
So I think, you're right. London, 2,000 years of history, right? So it's a long time. And you look at some of the new cities around the world and how they're emerging. And, the great thing about our city is the best of the old and the best of the new. I work in the City of London. You're there with an historic church, which is 400 years old, next to a brand new, incredible new building, from a global firm or a new bank opening somewhere in the world. So that juxtaposition is really interesting and makes our city really appealing, I think, as well. But I think, global capital has a choice. We are successful. We are the top sort of attractive city in the world in terms of global real estate allocation, although that's dipped in recent years because of some of the macro factors going on and sort of cost of capital. But we've got a lot of other cities competing for that investment now. And you think about what's happening in the Middle East, you spoke about there.
Of course.
The Far East, I was, again, working in Singapore and Sydney the last few years. I was really impressed at the pace that they're delivering onto infrastructure, green infrastructure, health and social sort of infrastructure for their cities. So I think for London, we've got to make sure in a global marketplace we remain competitive for that capital, because global capital does have that choice. But also, I think we're not necessarily good always at London at sort of scaling those investment opportunities. We've had some incredible projects like the Elizabeth Line, 16 billion. It's been a game changer for lots of reasons in terms of movement of people and all the regeneration around that site. And think about King's Cross, with related Argent and backed by the Australian super funds, superannuation, and Battersea Power Station, which is a Malaysia investment, beautiful restoration of the power station there and what they've done. But I think for us, we've got to think about for the next 10 years, what are those big moves? What are the big anchors? Where are those centers of gravity? How are we getting the transport unlocked, the energy provision, the data centers of the future, the regeneration sites, the housing? So I think for us, as one organization to go to the market and talk about London in 30 minutes and talk about those opportunities and to give those investors oversight of where the big moves are, what are the assets that are actually coming in the future, what are those different sectors where there's partnerships with the public sector to co-invest together. We have all that information in one spot. And I think historically, navigating London, the geography of it, all the different complexities of the planning and everything else, that's sort of taken away through an organization like that, and we can help investors navigate that as well.
So simplicity, ultimately, simplifying it from an investor perspective. Simplifying,
and also, I think, just giving independent view. We're not taking a fee for this service, right?
Yep.
So we're actually doing it on behalf of London and Londoners. We want the right outcomes for this city in terms of, net zero future, in terms of the values. So giving independent advice without taking a fee for doing that advice, there's value in that. And I think that's really important for our city as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So coming back to the green piece, we have, I think, probably the largest ultra-low emission zone in the world in London.
Yes.
What else should we be doing and could we be doing to really propel London from a net zero city, green city perspective?
It's so interesting because again, back in Australia the last couple of years, and you kind of forget most cities around the world are so carbon, as in cars and transport. Actually, I think we're one of the few that has. When I worked in the West End, 99% of people came on public transport. I mean, it's almost unheard of in other cities, right? You just realise these roads and these networks, not saying that traffic is bad, because actually e-vehicles and logistics and movement is part of our future, right? We're going to have to be able to move goods and services and people through cities, right? In a much better environmental way than we have been historically. But I think, air quality is a really important issue for London. And I think, when I worked in the West End, again, that's my reference point. But, we had hundreds of premature deaths because people were coming in and breathing really toxic air. And it was such a big issue for people that worked in the West End. There's 100,000 people that worked there. There was 25,000 residents there. There was 200 million people visiting there a year. Large scale. So we worked really hard through that partnership of businesses working together to really push forward for zero emission transport zones, for electrical infrastructure in the area. And that was great for that bit of London, but how do we scale that? So I commend the Mayor on pushing this forward. I mean, I know there's a cost in these issues sometimes. There's also about servicing and deliverability, but we've got to think about air quality in the future, and I think sometimes we need to accelerate some of these initiatives. So I think London's done a really good job with the ultra-low emission zone. I think other cities are looking to us. But the question I think you're sort of posing there is what next? How do we accelerate even further? How do we do that in the energy side, the housing and everything else that we need to do as well?
Awesome. And so look, let's think about the future then, as we say that. What is next for Opportunity London, first of all? Then I'll come to you. But I want to understand from an Opportunity London perspective, what's next?
So it's still quite a young partnership. I mean, I've sort of been post almost a year now, but it's been operating for about 3 years. And I give a shout out here to London and Partners, which is the growth agency for the capital, and Laura Citron, who's an incredible force of nature and really trying to grow the city as well. She's one of my co-chairs. And then the NLA on the other side, which is the built environment community. They've done some fantastic thought leadership into different aspects of what we need to do. So this wonderful triangle again of us, we're sort of the deal makers there, bringing all that together to try and unlock the capital to do stuff. But really our mission is that 100 billion, and we launched earlier this year 9 schemes in the capital, seeking about 9.5 billion. 2 of those schemes have now got funding, which is fantastic. We're launching another round next month in terms of another 5 schemes. One of them is a heat energy network as well.
Nice.
Again, looking for investment. So our success is not that we have a lot of partners around the table. We want the right partners. That's why Schneider is really important for us, given the expertise and the resource and the intellectual capacity that you can support us on. But our real success is getting these deals delivered. It's actually delivering the investments we can deliver, the houses, the homes, the energy, everything the city requires in the future through that capital investment. So for us, this year's been learning how the market's responding, what deals they're attracted to, how they like to engage with an organisation like us as well. And the work that sort of London and Partners and the Mayor's been doing, and with London councils and the boroughs, is what is the 25-year strategy for the capital? What's our infrastructure needs, our transport needs, the big anchor regeneration site? So I think going into 2025, that simplicity point for us to go to the market and say, this is the 25-year plan for the capital. Do you share our values? Do you want to invest? Let's close some more of these deals. That will be our success, I think, in the next sort of 12, 18 months.
Awesome. And then let's make it more personal. From your perspective, over, what did I have, 25 years in industry, pretty much, right?
Good lighting in here, right?
Yeah. Two of the questions that we ask everyone on the podcast is, what impact do you want to leave, Jace, as an individual, on the planet? And secondly, what's next for you, right? I appreciate there's probably still more to do at Opportunity London, but when you look to your future, what does that look like?
It's usually like I started off as a lawyer, and then I moved into sort of public affairs or regulatory affairs as well. And then I found this wonderful world of like public-private partnerships in cities. And I did it for the West End. I've been doing it in Sydney and Singapore. I've never had a whole city to play with like this. So personally, I mean, again, it's only sort of a year in, but it's such a privilege, genuinely, to like have this sort of responsibility to meet the different players, to try and unlock these deals. You know, I'm just going into me before what we're trying to do, but I think, you know, being able to actually signal and come back in 10, 15 years and say, we played a role in that. Something tangible has happened in the city. We've got there faster and quicker with net zero. We've built more housing. We've got really incredible transport. And somewhere along that journey, myself and Opportunity London with the team played a role. That would be so satisfying. So, you know, from a personal legacy, to be part of that journey and to get London to net zero quicker than the other cities around the world, to be that leader on a global scale, that's really important to me. But I think also just actually, you know, the partnership being successful and the partners like Schneider who are part of that, they're feeling value in the work that we do. That's important to me professionally as well.
Well, Jace, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking to you. I've enjoyed every minute of our conversation, and I look forward to seeing what happens with Opportunity London in the next 12 to 18 months, like you say.
Excellent. Thank you.
Best. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Do you need help calculating and tracking your carbon emissions? Use Zygo Activate decarbonisation software to calculate Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, track your progress, and reduce your carbon footprint. Search Zygo Activate and request your free demo today.